Hello everyone, this is the RPG Pundit here, the final boss of Internet Shitlords. And today I'm doing something a little different. I know that usually on this channel what I mostly do is post angry rants. And today though, I'm going to be doing a bit of a public service with something positive, and that will, I'm not kidding, and that will hopefully, for at least a few viewers, will draw them into a better way of playing D&D than they'd known before. And this is all because it struck me at one point that there were some people that I think perhaps were not familiar, oh there's my cat, that were not familiar with the term OSR. So the OSR is a term I use a lot. You'll see it in my hashtags on Twitter. What are you doing there? And some people who have only come in with this massive boom that we've seen now with D&D 5th edition might only play D&D 5th edition and might not know what else is out there or what the OSR is. So, to start with, I should say, back when I was a kid, we pretty much had two options. D&D, which back then was basic D&D or advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and then all the other RPGs, role-playing games that were not D&D. But today, people kind of have three options. They can play D&D 5th edition, they can play other role-playing games that are not D&D, or they can play other forms of D&D, or mix and match, in fact, those other forms together and with material from 5th edition if they want. And part of that is because there's the earlier editions of Dungeons and Dragons, right? You've got the old original box set, the advanced Dungeons and Dragons books, the basic and expert sets, that's the red set that had the dragon on the cover. You've got 2nd edition for those who like it. There's 3rd edition, and then there's 5th edition. So you've got all of those different editions of D&D out there that you can play that are the official editions, so to say. But besides that, you have a whole bunch of variants. I'm going to push my cat off. Sorry, Bondiga. Come on. There we go. So you've seen me pimping my game here, Lion and Dragon. Lion and Dragon is an OSR role-playing game. And the OSR stands for the old school Renaissance. Some people say the old school revival. I've heard a few people say the old school revolution. I prefer Renaissance because I think it most captures what's actually happened. It probably started as a revival. The OSR started a few years back in the 2000s, before print on demand became really big. And people back then had a problem, which was that they couldn't get very easily books of older editions. You had these old fogies, which we call in the hobby, we call them grognards. That's just the term for an old fogey in gaming. The grognards didn't want to play. Back then it was the newfangled 3.5 edition or the, whatever D&D did between 3.5 and 5th edition, whatever Wizards did. So they wanted to have the original game, but it was getting harder and harder to get the books. You could find, some beaten up old Dungeon Master's Guide in some used bookstore or something like that. But they wanted the rules so that they could pass that on and keep making stuff for it and stuff like that, right? So originally, what they did was they made a bunch of clones, because there's an interesting detail about intellectual property, which is that you can't copy a book because the book has copyright, but you can't copyright rules, okay? So the rules of a game cannot be copyrighted. So what they were doing is they were taking the exact same rules, taking out any of the trademarked content of Dungeons and Dragons, right? So no logo. You didn't have some of the monsters that are specific intellectual property of Wizards of the Coast today, what was once TSR's property. And then they were just rewriting it. So there was no cut and pasting involved. And what you get was another book that had all the same rules as the old D&D, but was not intellectual property of Wizards of the Coast. And they were, you know, these games, they might have been called stuff like Labyrinth Lord or, what was the other one? Swords and Wizardry, right? But they were basically just the old editions of D&D remade, okay? That was the clone period of the OSR. But then people relatively very soon started realizing, well, wait a minute, we can do the same thing. We can have, like, you know, there's this box of rules. There's this framework of design. And what can we do with that framework? We can do some wild and weird stuff. So we're making games now and game settings that are in essence the D&D rules, right? But that are completely new directions. And the OSR is today the most kind of innovative, the most avant-garde, the most out there set of ideas in RPG design. And they're way more cutting edge, you could say, than what you're going to get from the standard D&D or Pathfinder of, you know, the mainstream games. And this isn't to put those down. Remember, I helped in the process of making 5th edition. 5th edition is a great set of rules, and D&D 5e is fine as a game. It's quite playable, and they put out some very good products, right? But the thing you have to remember over and over again is that Wizards of the Coast is a corporation, right? They're a part of Hasbro, which is one of the biggest corporations in the world. And so they have a limited range of stuff that they are willing to do. They're going right for the middle of the range of what is acceptable. They're not going to try anything especially weird, anything especially risky, anything especially controversial. They're not going to try anything that doesn't stand a very good chance of doing well, right? And that's become even more the policy in 5th edition, where they're doing less books, but just focusing more on, you know, high quality content. So their content is very high quality, but it's within a very narrow margin. They do, you know, stuff within this margin, right? The OSR is much, much broader. It can cover everything. So now you've got all kinds of different OSR games, right? My game, Lion and Dragon, is an example of an OSR RPG. So the rules will be immediately familiar to anyone who plays Dungeons and Dragons. But the system and the setting for it, which is Dark Albion, is a totally different sort of system and setting than anything you'll ever find in Wizards of the Coast. And that's because Lion and Dragon goes out of its way to be a medieval authentic RPG, right? And so it presents magic in a totally different way that is based on what people in the medieval period imagined magic to work like. The monsters are different. Everything comes out of medieval folklore. The combat is much more deadly. Some of the rules have been adapted to making, you know, still within that framework of the OSR, right? But to make combat a much more deadly affair, something closer to what you see in, like, Game of Thrones and less like what you see in a video game where you can, you know, take a lot of hits and you know, you just have a little bar that's moving around there. There's no, you know, short or long rests that bring all your hit points back. In Lion and Dragon, unless you have a cleric perform a healing miracle on you, it's going to take you days to heal and stuff like that. And the world is, it's a setting that is basically a fantasy version of Europe in the 15th century, with a focus on things that happened. There's some characters of mine there. Things that happened during the War of the Roses in England. Okay, so they would never make a setting like this for Wizards of the Coast, and they make great settings in Wizards of the Coast. Again, I'm not criticizing them at all, right? But all the settings in Wizards of the Coast have to fit within a certain range, right? And that range is that it has to be something that is within a certain level of vanilla fantasy. Can't be too weird, can't be too controversial, can't be too dangerous. And it has to feature all of the classes, all of the races, right? You have to have all the potential monsters. You can add more monsters and special classes and special races and special powers and special items. But everything has to be usable within the context of the player's handbook. The player's handbook is not going to be changed for that setting. So you have the best example of that is Eberron, which was literally made so that you would be able to put in everything in all of the monster manuals at the time somewhere in that world, right? And that's why Eberron in the end, and Forgotten Realms and Greyhawk and Dragonlance, all these worlds are a little different from each other, but none of them are really all that different. And what I'm going to show you now is some of the other OSR products. I'm not just doing this to pimp my games. Of course I'm going to pimp my games, right? Here's Cults of Chaos, which is a Dark Albion source book that lets you create, with detailed tables, your own dark and sinister cults of witches and heretics and things like that for your players to hunt down as the Inquisition. Now, obviously, you'd never get that because it would be too... it would be accused of, oh my God, alt-right Nazis, right? They're hunting witches in this game, right? So that's never going to be in a Wizards of the Coast product, right? People asked, well, didn't you want to keep working for Wizards after being a consultant? Well, Wizards never had an intention of working with me, and I had no intention of working with them after being a consultant on 5th edition. And part of it is because of that. I couldn't make games like that for Wizards because Wizards doesn't have that kind of scope. So let me show you something else now. This is Operation White Box. Okay, this is a World War II combat game based on, you see, Swords and Wizardry, which is based on the original D&D rules, right? So you can, with D&D rules, play a platoon of soldiers in World War II, right? If that's the sort of thing you're into. And it could theoretically be compatible. You could take spells or monsters out of other products and put them right in there. And it would work if you wanted it to be, say, a fantasy World War II, right? This is made for historical special forces operations in World War II, but there's no reason why you couldn't bring in, if you really wanted to have tieflings and dragonborn in World War II, you could do that, right? That's part of the innovation of the OSR. And some things that are less weird than others, right? There's also adventures that are some of the best and most creative adventures. Castle Gargantua, highly recommended. This is a giant tower. It's kind of a mega dungeon with a randomized element. It's a really clever mechanic. Some very interesting thematic rooms, some special rooms. And it can be really huge or just kind of huge, depending on how long you want to play it. And it's all inspired by the 15th century story of Gargantua and Pantagruel, right? So it's just... it's brilliant. It's a work of brilliance that you will never see coming out of something more mainstream. The reason the OSR can do this stuff is because it's a mom and pop operation, right? The bigger companies like Paizo, like Wizards of the Coast, they're corporate. They have to do things that are only within that limited range. But if these are all small press people, the people that publish my games, the people that publish these other games I'm showing you now, they're all relatively small press and they can afford to take bigger risks. And you can bring all of this stuff into your D&D play. It's not a different RPG. It's an RPG that you can draw in. Here's Other Dust, which is a post-apocalyptic, a kind of harsh post-apocalyptic game. It's quite good. Again, the mechanics, if I can find the mechanics, they're basically the mechanics of D&D, right? So you look in see where the character sheet is here. Okay, yeah, so this is the character sheet here. So you have a list of skills. You have name, level, background, the ability scores, just like in Lion and Dragon, just like in, old D&D. You got levels with requirements for experience points, right? You've got the abilities. They're all the same, right? Here's another great example, one of the most popular OSR games, Dungeon Crawl Classics. This is like an old school D&D, but made into like just totally nuts gonzo play. Amazing art. You have characters. The the standard 4 classes, plus, elves, dwarves, and halflings. And this is, but it's got like some weird stuff, like unusual magical effects, a different take on monsters, special abilities, new spells, right? And this is a complete game, just like Lion and Dragon is a complete game, or Other Dust, or Operation White Box. But again, there's a ton of stuff. If you didn't want to just go out and play Dungeon Crawl Classics, there's a ton of stuff you could take from this and bring into whatever D&D version you're playing, if it's 5th edition or something else. There's all kinds of inspirational materials. And I mean, look at it, this is a unit. So here's some Dungeon Crawl Classics adventures, right? And again, you get the same situation. The adventures here can be a lot weirder and a lot more wonderful. This one here has a bunch of like high-tech elements. It's taking place in space on an asteroid. This one is an adventure where you're in a place that defies gravity. And there's just some weird freak with a giant eye for a head. Like, it's all great. It's all good, right? It's really gonzo. Venture Conquer King, another fantastic OSR system. This is very, vanilla fantasy, like Dungeon Crawl Classics is. But what this does is it puts a big focus on the later, higher level adventuring, where you can be in control of your own kingdom or manage your own, territory, run businesses. There's all kinds of stuff here on economics. And again, the system is going to be immediately recognizable to any of you. These are just a few, right? Here's Stars Without Number, which is a sci-fi game. And Machinations of the Space Princess, which is another sci-fi game. They're both very, very different from each other, right? Stars Without Number, made by the same guy who did Other Dust, if I'm not recalling wrong, is a game that, psionic powers, that for playing basically using the kind of the D&D rules in a serious sci-fi context, right? You could probably run something similar to Star Wars or Star Trek with it, or The Expanse, or any number of stuff, right? It's a more serious game. And Machinations of the Space Princess is a game by my friend Grim Jim, illustrated by Satine Phoenix, who was just hired by Wizards. And it's like full of like really weird stuff, weird mutants, wonderful, exciting scenarios, and it's a very sleazy game, as you might have just seen there, right? Like, it's got like strange creatures and characters, a whole bunch of random tables that are just excellent, including the table of what happened when you got too drunk at the space bar, which is probably the one I've used the most. Mutants and all sorts of wild and weird stuff, right? So a great kind of much more tongue-in-cheek, but sort of like for a weird sci-fi sort of game, right? Like, I don't know, Flash Gordon or stuff like that, right? There's Arrows of Indra. That's another one I did. This is an OSR game that is set in mythic India, right? And it's full of elements from the actual Indian mythology of the Mahabharata. You get, Krishna, the kingdoms of India, and some Indian versions of dungeons, the Indian underworld, and all that sort of stuff. Some monsters, and yeah. So I think you get the gist of what I'm saying here. But the point is that you can get into really weird stuff. It's an adventure. Ghoulkeep and the Ghoul Lands. An excellent castle-type dungeon, very standard, except that it's got a lot of interesting undead, and around it is a little kingdom of undead, which is quite intriguing. Venger Satanis's Islands of Purple Haunted Putrescence. This is again, that one and this one are not actual games; they're adventures or settings. The Island of Purple Haunted Putrescence by another one. Machinations was by Grim Jim. This one's by Venger. Those are my two co-hosts and inappropriate characters. This is a weird fantasy island full of like the most bizarre stuff, space aliens and mutants and Cthulhu stuff and naked ladies and all kinds of things. Like this stuff would not be viable for Wizards to publish these days, right? It would be inappropriate, as in inappropriate characters, right? So it's it's one of the great adventure scenarios. You see it's a hex map of 3 islands, and basically you put your characters on there and they get to go where they want and check out whatever weird stuff they want to check out, right? One last one here. This is Yun Suin, the Purple Hand. To me, maybe like an example of the most brilliant, most ingenious. Like if my Arrows of Indra is based on Eastern mythology, but it's like based on like the most traditional Orthodox Eastern mythology of like the stories of Krishna and Arjuna and the Mahabharata and stuff like that. Yun Suin is like just this weird stuff based on the weirdest like Tibetan and Himalayan myths, and you can play like snail men and crab men and all this sort of crazy stuff, right? And then it's got a bunch of random tables that lets you fill out areas of different places, like in the Yellow City, and artifacts and all sorts of cool stuff. This is like a really on the edge of setting design. Again, this isn't really a complete game exactly. It's more like a setting book. But so yeah, there you have it. So this is the OSR for you, the old school revival, and it will open your head up to like a whole other level of innovation. This is just a tiny example, right? These aren't by any means everything that's out there. There's tons of stuff, and some of it again is kind of conventional, just like interesting adventures, and some of it is game rules or game settings or game adventures that are just wild in their cutting edge innovation and like interesting ways they're manipulating either the rules or the worlds, the possible concepts of D&D play into whole new directions. All right. So you want to check this out. You want to go and look and see if you can't add stuff that will take your D&D play. I'm not saying don't play 5th edition. Play 5th edition as much as you want, right? And it's a great game. But look at the other stuff out there to kind of expand your consciousness of what you can actually do with the game. All right? So I guess that's it for today. If this is your first time watching, please subscribe to this channel. Also, check out the sister channel to this, which is Inappropriate Characters, where I chatted up with Venger Satanis and Grim Jim DeBurrow about all kinds of controversial and interesting stuff that's happening in the RPG world. We're going to have a chat soon, a live chat of some kind, and we'll keep you posted on when that's going to happen. And thanks to everyone who subscribes. Thanks to everyone who's supporting the Inappropriate Characters Patreon. Please check it out and support it. And yeah, keep on going with looking at what you can really do with RPGs instead of wasting your time thinking about, like community inclusiveness and stuff like that. There's nothing more inclusive than diversity of ideas. Currently smoking Lorenzetti Egg with Country Doctor.